Hello and welcome to this Alumni Extra, part of the series in which we continue a discussion already started through another initiative in the Alumni programme. Today's Alumni Extra follows on from our July webinar, The Attention Crisis, Maintaining Focus in an Increasingly Online World, presented by Susan Pearse, author and leadership coach, who's also here with me today. So welcome, Susan. During that webinar, there were quite a few questions that we were unable to answer within the timeframe. So today we have a chance to discuss those with Susan and perhaps reflect a little on the topics discussed. So thank you to Susan this morning for joining us again to continue this discussion and helping us to pay attention to paying attention. And thank you also to those people who posed questions during the webinar. I thought we would start with the concept of wandering attention and the limited attention bucket that you discussed. You mentioned specifically the concept of drifting. One of our participants asked the question, is drifting the same as switching attention? And if so, is returning to the first task the critical issue here?
Yes. So yeah, it's a little bit different because often, and again, it depends how you define drifting, but to me, drifting almost has this connotation that your mind is doing a thing. So it's here focusing on some emails, then it's drifting off to what it sees over there or drifting back to a report. Switching is a very different thing because when you're doing that type of drifting, essentially what's going on in the brain is that we're always firing up the area that we're using at the time. So drifting can actually result in many, many different areas of the brain being lit up at once, hence why we get some sort of lull in productivity. Switching is a very different thing because, again, if you imagine the visual of I'm doing something and this area of the brain's lit up, what we want to do is power that down before we fire up another area. So to switch really well, I mentioned, your breath is one of your greatest kind of resources for powering your brain down. So for example, if you were doing an email, someone came up to your desk, the way you would switch is I always feel my feet on the floor, take a breath, then turn to the person who wants my attention, deal with that, come back, switch again by taking a breath, feeling my feet on the floor and going back to my task. So that way you are picking up all of your attention and bringing it to the task at hand.
And so then drifting's more like when you're reading a book, but you've had 16 other thoughts and you've no idea what you just read.
Yes, exactly.
Whereas switching is more about focusing on individual things.
Yeah, drifting is real. Yeah, the difference I see is, the switching is the conscious placement of your attention away from the thing that you were doing and onto the thing that you're now doing.
Yeah. And so there was also a question about what degree attention and memory are related or whether they're the same thing. So particularly around things like the PIN numbers, I think you mentioned in the conversation, is that a long-term memory or is that actually an attention thing?
I don't think they're the same thing, but I think attention definitely impacts on memory because I think we'd all know that if we've been in a really busy time where we're jumping from one thing to another, we start to find it's hard to remember, to take your phone or to do the simplest of tasks. And this is really back to that kind of bottleneck that happens, that we try to put too much information in and things actually get jammed. So there's a little bit of a link there that if we are putting too much in, it's going to have an impact on our memory. But the other thing is, I talked in the webinar about, show us a wave if you ever meet someone and then you can't remember their name. Again, if you trace back those times, which we can all remember, it's usually because as we're meeting them, our attention is in other places as well. Sort of like, where's my friends gone or what am I going to do next? That if you give full quality attention in the present moment, you are more likely to remember things. So yeah, not the same, but definitely impacting very heavily on each other.
And being really conscious, I suppose, about knowing that number is what you need to remember. So a PIN number for my bank card, for example, is different to the multi-factor authentication number that Griffith sends me when I need to log into my email account in the morning, because I know I only need that for 2 seconds, but I know I need the PIN number for longer.
Very true. And I think, that just speaks to this thing of we've got to accept that we can't take in everything. So we've got to start making choices about where we're spending our attention. It took me, like, I always wanted to remember every single person's name. But, you know, then when I started to deal with hundreds of people in workshops, it was just never going to be possible. And while I was trying to get that into my brain, I would be missing out on something else. So we've got to make choices because we can't do it all.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the other comments that came through is that some people find that attention can be more focused on a task when they're listening to music rather than when they have just the task in front of them. Why is that? Is music some kind of buffer to the background brain? And is there a particular kind of music that's useful there?
Yeah, there is some different kind of research on this, but I'll probably take a step back and, you know, theoretically, we will learn best, remember things, take in more when it's just attention on the job. So when we're reading and our eyes are engaged, our, you know, mental activity is low and there's just one source of something that we're taking in through our attention. But I think realistically, these days, you know, a lot of people report that they sit down to read and they have their attention on 30 different things. And so this is where something like music or, you know, other sources can be useful, because for some people it's taking it from 20 pieces of distraction to just 2 things. And in terms of the type of music, there's a lot of research around on classical music. So, you know, listening more to Beethoven and Mozart and different pieces do a whole range of things for your brain. But I'm also, you know, probably thinking it's the type of music where you feel uplifted, because again, there's a lot of, you know, research around when we feel joy in our brain, we open up more mental capability. But yeah, I would have to say that I still tell my daughter she can't study and listen to music at the same time.
Yeah, I had those same conversations with mine too. I think sometimes it's horses for courses. So if you want to focus on reading something, then perhaps classical music is less distracting. But if you need to be high energy to get through a task, then, you know, a bit of 80s rock always works in my house.
I'm completely with you. And yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it's just kind of remembering that principle that the more things we're trying to take in, it's going to impact on the quality of attention with something. So, you know, again, a lot of the research around the brain in silence has, you know, more benefits than things like music. So it's no hard and fast rules with this stuff. It's what works for you, but the goal is about getting less sources of distraction in.
So that buffer concept that was raised is probably not too far off the mark then.
Yeah. Particularly for someone who does have a very busy mind and would be more likely to think of 20 things.
Yeah, absolutely. And that takes us nicely into the online kind of always on world, because that's usually where all of the 20 distractions are coming from. In particular, though, one of the guests raised some questions around cultural differences and suggested that in some cultures, organisations are taking advantage of that always on online world and making people work more and balance more tasks all at once. What would your thoughts be on that one?
Yeah, I definitely think in Australia, and I think it would be the same in America and other countries, have a real emphasis on glorification of busyness. And that definitely impacts, you know, I go into a lot of organizations and I talk to them about how we're creating a culture of busyness by, you know, expecting people to respond to things straight away, expecting them to be at work for really long hours. So you've got the culture in terms of countries, but then you've got culture in terms of different organizations as well. And, you know, I just always encourage people, particularly, you know, I work with a lot of executive teams who are like, but it's a culture of business. And I say, well, you are actually the culture. So it's going to take a few people to start breaking that down. And I think as soon as we start to see that busyness doesn't lead to greater impacts, greater success, greater outcomes, it actually does the opposite. Once we can get our heads around that, I think there'll be more brave people who are prepared to actually start breaking down some of those cultures.
Yeah, and again on that culture culture side, on the flip side of that, one of the participants noted an Italian phrase, dolce far niente, and I'm certain that's not pronounced correctly, but meaning pleasantly doing nothing. And I wondered, thinking to that Mediterranean culture of that area, whether that emphasizes a cultural difference there. Yeah. And again, they were asking about whether cultural influences impact our attention or the ability to have idle time.
Yeah, absolutely they would. I mean, I actually had a period where I went and studied some quantum physics in Italy, and I was coming with my mindset of we're going to be like studying 12 hours a day and all of this, and on the first day I think it started at 9, went to 11, we then had 4 hours off, came back for another hour or two, and then an early finish, and just a very different way. I think here we try to cram in as much as possible and use every moment, but over there it was very much take some information, digest it, let it settle, and that value of the idle time where between lessons you'd go out walking as well as resting, as well as having beautiful long lunches. And so I think there definitely is some cultural differences where that slow type of living is definitely valued in more countries than it is in others.
Yeah, definitely. And I can fully embrace the long lunches and siestas in the middle of the day. That would be quite nice.
It was great. And I really think I learnt more during that time. And this is like what I was talking about in the session, is that we've got to see rest as an intellectual activity. It's not wasted time, lazy time. It is actually an intellectual activity that performs a function that makes the brain more productive.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And so we discussed then some cultural differences. How about gender differences? And in particular, gender differences in attention. The questioner here was particularly thinking about the overlap with the concept of the mental load, the organising, list making, planning that you do to manage your life and to manage the lives of those who are dependent on you. And I think potentially in this case was thinking children in particular. And obviously most of us carry some form of mental load about our work, our household responsibilities, financial obligations, that kind of thing. But what makes up that burden and how it's distributed within households is not always necessarily equal.
No.
And whether that perhaps results in a gender-based difference in the capacity for focus and attention.
Yeah, probably a few issues there. I mean, definitely research in Australia, and I'm sure other parts of the world, says that even though we've come closer to equality, it's women that are carrying more of that load in terms of household responsibilities and child rearing. Not in every house, but, that's what the research is saying in general. And that for sure leads to busyness of mind, because it's almost like from the first minute you get up, you're thinking about not just getting yourself out the door if you're a working parent, but also the children, and then all of their emails from schools and different things on. It just becomes a lot in the brain to juggle. And I think though then for men, the differences between the sexes would be more about we're focusing on different things, we're being distracted by different things, because there's a lot of research to say that women's brains are wired to be able to look broadly, see connections between things. Men's brains are better at going deep into something. And so I would probably say that men carry the same mental load, they're just thinking about other things. And I think all of this really comes back to we might have different pressures on ourselves, but we need to jump in the driver's seat of having the discipline around that. So we're not thinking about the grocery list when we're at a meeting, or the thing we've got to get our daughter to, that we've, got everything scheduled. We're working in a way that we can be fully in something when we're there.
Yeah, and I guess that's also, so, even if you divide the physical tasks around a household equally, it's I think from the implication of that conversation, it's still generally the females in the household who are thinking, okay, so tomorrow's school sports day, or, we've got to remember to take them to the dentist, or, those kind of things. Is that so? And I'm not sure if the next question is just gender related or just different types of different people kind of thing. But one of our participants was interested in your opinion of their partner, who doesn't appear to do any of the intrusion of electronic devices, to-do lists, overthinking, distractions, things that we were discussing, doesn't check emails, never has a to-do list, and yet will seemingly waste an enormous amount of time flitting from one task to another, taking attention away, but also seems perfectly content and happy to do so.
Yeah. And, you know, all of this comes down to that conversation about what is it important to put my attention on right now. So someone can be just as inefficient and distracted, even if they don't have technology, but as the participant's saying, that they get distracted by the bright, shiny objects. That'd be interesting. Oh, that'll be good over here and that over here as well. So it's still a source of distraction. It's just not coming from the same type of thing. And the question there would be for, was it a him?
I'm not sure. It's
him or her to, if where they're spending their attention is aligned to what they believe is important. And then when you've got a couple involved, it's kind of a couple conversation there as well. If it's aligned to what's important for that couple and that person, then great. But if at the end of the day, nothing's getting done, most of the day is spent, with that wandering and not actually getting anything out of that and focusing on what's important, then I guess it's an issue.
Yeah, so distractions being or a different way of losing attention, not necessarily technology based, but
totally. And yeah, I think I mentioned in the webinar, it's like it definitely has changed when everything went online, but it almost opened the floodgates for us to be distracted about everything. So even people who go and have their tech-free weekend at the beach could actually be watching the sunset, worrying about all the things that are potentially happening next week. So same sort of impact of distraction.
And I suppose there was a bit of an implication there around, time being wasted. Yeah. But then is time that you enjoy wasting, is that really wasted time?
Yeah. And this is where I think it's just linked to what's important. Like where we get into an issue is when there's just unconscious sort of wandering and we're not consciously choosing where we want to put our attention at a given point in time. And if he or she is going, that's actually important to me, that keeps me happy, my well-being great, and whatever else between the couple, then it's not wasted time. But if they're getting to the end of the day and a whole heap of things aren't getting done and you're not getting a payback for that time, then it's an issue. And this is the thing, we say pay attention, and pay has that connotation that we get something back in return. So to always be kind of going, is what I'm paying attention to giving me important things back in return? And for someone, it's like, yeah, because it's a rest and it relaxes me. For others, it's like, no, because nothing is actually getting done.
So maybe that's more one for a relationships counsellor than a mind gardener then.
Yes, possibly. Possibly. I get in all my sessions, my partner's like this, can you help me with my mother, father, whatever else? And this is the thing, I think, when you want to influence someone else's attention, you always start with yourself, because so much can be, spread through the application of our own attention.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the other things that you talked about a fair bit was the what-ifing and the rerunning. And I think we answered some questions around this in the Q&A on the session itself, but one of the particular questions was about what if your what if is real. So this participant's anxiety was particularly around climate change and its impacts. How do you advise dealing with what-ifing and anxiety around very real things?
Yeah. And, there's a lot of those, but the questions come down to, is this a productive use of my attention? So if you are what-ifing, translating that into, here's some things I'm going to change in my life to contribute to the bigger problem of climate change, or I'm going to start a group, or I'm going to start educating people. If it's going into something that productively will impact on the issue, then that's a great use of your attention. But if you are just lying on the bed worrying, catastrophizing, even if they are real issues and it's keeping you, it's immobilizing you, that's when it's what ifing. So
yeah.
It's back to, you know, what's the bit that I can control? Jump on, start turning my deliberations and my what ifing into some productive action, and then that's a great use of attention.
Yeah, that's a really good tip on that one, actually, because it is very easy to get kind of paralyzed by the anxiety and the thinking and the overthinking. Whereas if you broke it down into a small thing that you can do to make a difference, it might take away a level of that anxiety.
Totally. Mm-hmm. And I think that's more often the case, that the people who do a lot of overthinking, there's a link between that and actually doing nothing about it. So that paralysis, it is a thing.
So on a similar topic, tips for people who have bad rerun conversations or continually rerun bad things that happened. It's like when you're trying to get to sleep at night and something that you said in 1982 that offended somebody pops back into your brain and you have a cringe moment. How do you stop your brain from using the time that you're trying to go to sleep to go over all of those reruns?
Yeah. I actually had this probably, I don't know how long ago, 20 years ago it probably is, where I developed this habit, and it sounds really crazy, but of a Saturday afternoon, I would lie on my bed as if I was like going to relax and rest, but I would use that time to beat myself up about all of these things that kind of were happening. So I had to literally, when I realized the impact of what it was doing, stop the habit, train my brain to not go into that cycle of things. So I literally, every time, and the brain would be pulling me back to get on that bed and start, rerunning things. And I literally had to go, no, I'm choosing to put my attention on something else. And, after doing that mind training, I find it really hard to go over past events now. My brain just doesn't have the pathways for doing it. So I do believe it's a good idea that if you're doing that before you go to bed, that you actually stop the habit. And that's, a matter of substituting it with something else. So doing some deep breathing, doing some body scanning where you're breathing into and relaxing every part of your body to actually stop that habit. But, the thing that I would then do on top of that, so if you're rerunning driving on the way home from work, yes, you want to stop that habit, but also you might actually say, well, when I get home, I will actually just write down 3 lessons that I've learned from that situation today. So instead of going circularly around the reruns, again, moving to action, which is what have I learned and what am I going to do differently? And only allowing your brain to do that productive thinking that moves on to some action rather than the circular stuff that's just going to keep you stuck.
So using reruns productively.
Yeah.
Rather than letting them spiral you down into anxiety.
Yeah. And, there's a lot of techniques there. I'm not sure if I mentioned that in the brain, it takes 3 positives to make up for a negative. So if you're beating yourself up about something that went on in a meeting, you weren't clear about something, to actually move your brain to go, what are 3 things that worked really well today, is a good space as well, because it's a bit of a slippery slope between negative rerunning and getting into a really negative state of mind.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that probably actually leads into the next question, which was what happens when you let your mind rest, but you feel unsettled, maybe feeling guilty that you're not using that time to do what you need to do. Yeah, it probably leads into that.
Yeah. And, I just put things like that round to, we've got to make conscious choices, and once we've made them, be fully wherever we are. So, I think in one of the books I talk about this thing that was kind of quite popular when my kids were little, and this was this thing about that juggle between, am I going to be at the swimming carnival or am I going to be at work? And, you might make a decision to be at the swimming carnival, but the whole time you're there, you're guilty about being away from work. And I just really encourage, make a conscious choice, then be fully there. Otherwise, it wasn't worth the choice. If you're going to be at the swimming carnival thinking about work, you're not paying attention to anything that's actually going on. So I'm a big believer of trying to ban that G word, being guilt, and just get in a more empowered position to make choices. Then once that's made, full attention, because the reality is full attention at the swimming carnival will be amazing for your children, but it'll also be great for your brain when you get back to work, and you'll be twice as productive.
And vice versa, if you choose to stay at work, you'll be feeling guilty about not going to the swimming carnival, and none of that's particularly healthy for your mental well-being.
Exactly. Yeah.
So on that topic of well-being, you mentioned meditation and the value of that in helping your brain, and some people are more inclined towards kind of active meditation, and one person particularly mentioned running, but there was also a question about yoga and whether that helps get rid of negative thoughts. Should we try then and make our physical activity time meditative? For example, I usually listen to podcasts when I'm running. So should I be doing that, or should I be focusing on what I'm really doing and let my mind rest, rather than, I guess you're multitasking your exercise at that point.
Yeah, you are. And again, like, it's not about don't do this, do that, but maybe you want to mix it up a little bit. But I have this argument with a really good friend of mine all the time, where she's got a really busy mind, and I say, you should try some meditation, and she goes, well, I meditate when I'm out running. She does a lot of mountain trail type of running, and I definitely sort of can see her side of things, that bringing your mind so into focus with every step that you're taking, with every beat of your heart and your breath and all that sort of stuff, is a really, really great activity to do that meditatively, and it would be amazing for you. I think sitting down in silence is another level though. So even for the exercises, I would definitely recommend you make that meditative, and you may not want to do that 7 days a week. You might only say 2 days a week my run or my cycle is going to be with my mind fully on every movement of my muscles. But then I think, and the research would back up, that sitting in silence does another thing for your brain. It gets to a deeper level of what it's influencing. So I would also try to do that. So then the podcasting while walking, again, another friend, I have this kind of argument as well, because he always has the podcast on and he's walking away, and there was a time where myself and my children actually passed him and he didn't even sort of see what was going on around him. He was so engrossed in this. And again, I think it's great that there's a time for learning and fertilizing your brain, but then walking, really bringing in the blue sky, the feeling of the breeze against your arms and legs, every muscle and how it moves, that adds another dimension as well. So I would definitely be making sure I do a bit of that.
And you're probably far less likely to trip over things as well if you focus on rather than focusing on.
And I think too, like, I was reflecting on him that day that I saw him, and it was like, I always, think of, when you get that sort of frown there, and he's like this, that he would have got back feeling exhausted on every level. The mental and the physical level, as opposed to walking. And people often say, idle time, what does that look like? Because we're always thinking. And I just think that it's the moments, and the way you describe it is look up. The times where we just look up and around and take everything in. So more times like that on our walks be fantastic too.
And there's quite a lot of kind of memes and things around that on the internet, isn't there? How nobody ever sees what's going on around them, because everybody's focused kind of 6 inches in front of their faces. And definitely an area for consideration. So, I think we've come pretty much to the end of the questions. We've covered quite a lot of ground today, and also from the webinar in July. Is there anything else at this point that you think an extra nugget that we might want to add into the conversation, or?
I think
force, perhaps.
I can't remember whether I spoke about this on the webinar, but it's the link between attention and care as well, that this whole thing, I certainly have a lot of people that complain my partner's always on their phone, and just that impact that being distracted has on the people around you, whether that's work colleagues, whether that's people at home. Because essentially in the book One Moment Please, we talk about attention is the currency of care, that if you're talking to me right now and I'm like this and on the phone, it tells you very clearly that I don't care about what you're saying. And I think, you know, the more we look at attention as this currency of care, what does it say to the people around us when we're distracted, but also that bigger notion like the climate change and whatever else? What do we care about? And are we spending attention on progressing some of those issues rather than mindless things that are just keeping our brain entertained?
I think that's a really beautiful note to end on there, that, you know, this isn't all just about you and your ability to have attention and focus. This is about caring about the people that are around you as well. And so on that note then, I wanted to thank you for your attention again today, Susan, and for being so generous with your time, with your advice, and you know, helping our alumni with some great tips and tools to work with them, to support them in responding to the attention crisis that we've been referring to. And I wanted to also thank all the alumni as well for joining us again for this Alumni Extras conversation. And we do look forward to bringing more great content to our alumni community soon. So thank you again.
Thanks.